Welcome to Next in Tech, an S&P Global Market Intelligence podcast where the world of emerging tech lives. I'm your host, Eric Hanselman, Chief Analyst for Technology, Media, and Telecom at S&P Global Market Intelligence. And today, we're going to be digging into data a little more than we have in some of the recent episodes and talking specifically about the data center knowledge base. And with me to talk about it is Stephanie Williams. Stephanie, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Eric. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's great to have you on. And I think our listeners have heard bits and pieces about the data center knowledge base and some of the things we do with it, but we've never actually had a chance to really dig into the details of it. And I wanted to sort of look at the various aspects because it's a fascinating set of data and one that has so many implications in so many different places in a lot of the work that we wind up doing. But before we head down into the interesting pieces of what we're doing with it, it'd be great to get some background on really what it's all about and how's it built, and what are the nuts and bolts of what we'd like to refer to as the DCKB.
Sure. So if you look at our website, the official definition of the DCKB is an industry-leading database that represents the most accurate, authoritative, and comprehensive set of data center intelligence in the market. So now most of our listeners are probably going, okay, well, what exactly does that marketing speak mean? And what it means is that the data center services and infrastructure team here at S&P has collected and vetted over 100 key metrics on nearly 8,800 leased data centers as of 2022. While we look at a global scale, our recent research has had a particular focus on growing our coverage of Latin America and Asia Pacific, but we do have teams in EMEA and North America that are constantly updating those markets as well.
Well, and when you talk about teams, this is something that's a particular resource-intensive way of looking at this that really feeds what is that knowledge base.
Yeah, so we have 11 of us on the data center team right now, and we take a look at the data center industry from the bottom up. So what that means is we actually collect the data at a facility level, and then we aggregate that data for city or market level analysis for our clients. Whereas other firms in the industry might only look at what's coming or the top markets in the world or just the top providers in a specific market, the DCKB actually aims to include every leased data center facility.
Oh, wow. And that, when you talk about that 8,000 number, what we're talking about is in many cases really visiting and physically verifying, being there in person to sort of see what a lot of these facilities are doing, getting the background in terms of how they're put together, all the various aspects of the facility itself.
Yeah, so that's what actually differentiates S&P's research from the other research firms in the data center industry. We do a lot of groundwork behind the scenes, kind of in our offices, but then we actually go out into the field and we tour the data centers. So we touch down in about 30 markets annually across the team and validate the metrics of the facility. So the location, the size of the land and building, the leasable space, the power and cooling metrics, all of those things that people are looking for in the DCKB, we validate those in person as facilities are built out over time.
I look at the team's travel schedule and you're high-ing around the planet.
Yeah. So, we're gearing up for 2023 and we spend a lot of time setting up appointments. But the way we're set up, we are divided geographically. So our analysts don't cover a specific set of firms. We cover a specific set of geographies. Just as an example, instead of me focusing on, say, Digital Realty or Equinix or AirTrunk, I look at Dallas, Ohio, and Australia. This means that over the time that I've spent covering these markets, some of them 8 to 12 years now, I've been able to concentrate on building relationships with operations personnel at the same sites or within the same cities over time. So as we build those key relationships, we build trust, and we're able to get into deeper conversations with providers that go far beyond the metrics. and give us insight to our research that other companies may not be able to get unless they have worked on those same relationships.
Well, it seems like one of those things that also you get that relationship, that long term, continuing repeat visit perspective on the facility itself. You get to see how it's evolving, you see how personnel are evolving. But the pandemic must have put a real crimp in things.
Yeah, so that was really interesting after spending years touring 100 plus data centers annually. Everything shut down. We couldn't get into the facilities. Data center providers got really busy with potential customers and new customers moving into their facilities. It was really challenging for us, especially with people that we hadn't visited with previously, to get calls on schedules to continue to validate these metrics virtually. Now, where we did have relationships in place, it was a lot easier to send an email to Joe down in Dallas and say, "Hey, we haven't talked in a while. I know you have an expansion coming online. Let's get some time on the schedule." And Joe or whoever would clear a little bit of time, and we would get those updates, which allowed us to continue our work on the DCKB, getting those good metrics. And we knew we could trust that information because they trusted us with their information.
Oh, and you'd been to for those facilities that already existed. You'd probably been there before. You had at least some idea of what the expansion looked like, what the whole real estate footprint looked like, those sorts of things.
Yeah, yeah. And for providers that were building out new facilities, so, if somebody already had a data center in Dallas and they were building out a new one, we knew kind of what to expect from their previous builds. And we were able to garner what they were doing in the new build, even though we weren't able to physically walk the building at the time. We started touring again last year, and providers were so excited to get us back in the building. We are gearing up this year, and I've already got people emailing me going, "Hey, when are you coming to Sydney? When are you coming to Dallas? We need to get this booked." So pretty excited to get out there and get back to it.
Ramp back up and on the road. Well, I think it's also important to define, if beyond all the characteristics that are in the knowledge base, those things that you don't cover. And what are they and why not?
Yeah, so some things just are really challenging to cover in such a small space. The first thing on most people's lists are, where are the cloud-owned data centers? They're not in here. So that's your Google, your AWS, your Microsoft, and those guys. We do track those, but we do it separately, and those aren't available as a product yet. And that's about all the teaser I can give. But that's something we're working on this year.
Oh, cool. Well, because that is a very different chunk of the market. And I guess a lot of the reasons why we were doing the knowledge base to begin with was because those who were interested in multi-tenant capacity, if they wanted to figure out where could they get capacity, that was really what it was all about. But
Yeah.
now, with cloud becoming a larger percentage of that market, there's more to see.
Yeah, and sometimes it can be challenging to gather that data. Cloud providers aren't always forthcoming with what they've got coming online in terms of space and power. And those facilities are used a lot differently than the leased data center facilities. So it can be kind of an apples to oranges comparison in some ways, but we are working to get that integrated. The other thing is that we do have historical data on the leased data centers. So we go back as far as 2010 on older facilities, and then we forecast out to 2027. Not all of that is available to our DCKB customers right now. But what we do is we use that information internally to generate our forecasts, which appear in our reports that focus on specific cities or countries. So you might see reports on London or the whole of France. And that kind of information is mostly for internal use, not our customer-facing product.
Yeah, and gives you insights into where people are reaching capacity, where there's likely build out, demand, and all those sorts of aspects of it.
Exactly.
Which actually brings me to the question. So there certainly are those people who want to buy capacity are interested, but more broadly, why are people interested in data centers, and who's really using the DCKB, and how are they putting it to work?
Yeah, most people wouldn't think that, data centers are very interesting or something that just seems like it's going to garner a lot of attention, but they actually spend a lot of time in the news these days. It comes up more and more often, mostly because of the amount of power that they use. It's not unusual for a large data center to use the same amount of power as a small city or a small town. It's a lot of power.
Yeah, we're
Um,
talking tens of megawatts and in the average environment. So yeah, not insubstantial.
Exactly. And so it means that, governments and even local citizens who are concerned about power resources spend a lot of time paying attention to what data centers are building and where. And the other part of that is making sure, understanding, are these giant buildings using renewable energy resources? So we're often asked to calculate how much energy data centers are using in a specific area. That's where the DCKV comes in line, combined with some of our estimates on cloud and enterprise data centers, which are also not in the DCKB, using our vote resources. So this tends to be of interest to government officials, journalists, and energy firms that are looking to build out additional infrastructure to support these buildings.
Figuring out what the region's capacity is and being able to do some forward-looking planning about what the needs are going to be, what capacity is there. And there's an awful lot that they could potentially do to leverage that data.
Exactly. And so other firms that we see include investors and lenders. We see a lot of growing interest from real estate firms, particularly real estate investment firms. And what they are doing is looking for a way to invest in growth that is related to technology, but data centers also have many of the same characteristics as your standard commercial real estate, which makes them more appealing to some of these real estate investment firms. So they're expensive to build. There's a lot of capital investment that's required in building a data center. And a lot of capital investment means a lot of research going into it before they sign a deal. So these clients tend to look at the long-term growth prospects of specific markets or even individual data center firms before they decide whether or not to pursue a deal.
Yeah, I mean, these are facilities that have got lifespans of 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's going to be a lot of upfront research before siting takes place, all the planning that's necessary for, is there going to be long-term power capability? And now, of course, is there access to green energy? What's going to be the impact on the region? A lot of different aspects that are coming into play when you start looking at that siting decision, as well as what the growth prospects are for that particular region.
Right. And then once you have selected a site and built a data center, you need customers. And we actually serve a lot of data center end users, so cloud providers, enterprises, small businesses, telecom providers, more. The list goes on and on. These companies are looking for somewhere to store their equipment, and they rent space in these buildings. They use the DCKB to basically understand what space is available in a particular area, who the providers are in a specific market, and then what data center related services those providers offer to support their actual physical deployment.
Yeah, you mentioned telecom, and that's actually one of the things that I've had some experience with the DCKB and actually bringing the DCKB into other sets of data and starting to cross some of those data products together, things like cell tower location.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that, from a telecom perspective, being able to figure out where is their data center capacity at what density of cell towers. If I'm going to be looking at backhauling data from towers, is there a facility that's close enough? What does that density look like? What are those places that are maybe underutilized? A lot of the things about once you've got the physical locations, the data center, being able to go then track to where those tower locations are means that you now can start to triangulate, what's the latency, what's going to be the performance of applications that are out there. There's so many different things that we can cross and integrate around that.
Yes, and it's so interesting to watch the two-way searching going there, because data centers are looking at where, telecom providers are looking at where data centers are, and data centers are looking at where telecom providers are. And
Both
so
sides of the coin.
both sides of the coin. And we do serve the other side of that. So data center providers themselves actually use the DCKB in multiple ways. one of the ways is to get a better understanding of where the opportunities are, where they can drop a new facility into a different market or a market where they've already got facilities, and continue to gain some market share. And they also use it to keep an eye on what their competitors are doing. So it's really interesting to watch as they kind of see what each other are doing over time and make fiscal decisions based on where everybody else is. So we have that aspect, and then we have the builders and the infrastructure manufacturers that are also using the DCKB to figure out where the data center providers are going, and that helps them to plan out their manufacturing and sales efforts over time.
And figuring out what, should they be ramping up production? Should they be scaling up, and in which regions they need to do it? Yeah, it's so many different aspects that all come together when you start looking at the fundamental aspects of what those trajectories are for data center build and operation.
Very diverse set of customers we've got.
Well, so I want to talk a little bit about when we start thinking about uses around the DCKB specifically. I guess, what are things that organizations should consider when they're looking at the DCKB? And we've talked about some of these capabilities, but I'm curious about your perspectives on really looking at this in more detail. For those who are considering looking at the database itself, what should they be keeping in mind?
I think the first thing that comes to my mind is dispelling the myth that this data center, this data can seem very easy to find. How hard can it be, right? You have websites all over the place that claim that they have all this data center info. You have the providers putting information out on their own websites, but it's actually really difficult at times to get accurate data and then to keep it up to date continuously. So everybody in the data center industry struggles with that across all of the different verticals we just discussed using the DCKB as well as other research firms. A lot of this stems from there are some facilities, some providers that just don't want their data centers to be found in general. And then once you do find them, they don't want you to know how big they are, how much floor space they have, how much electricity they're using, because that brings attention to their facility that they may or may not want, going back to that whole negative connotation around the power usage. So, some providers can also be, we'll say, generous about the size of their building, or they might be a little bit. Exactly.
Well, but it's, and again, it's the competitive aspect of, sure, we've got huge amounts of capacity and we're most of the way full, so it's I'm sure it's a matter of, it comes down to price negotiations, when there's scarcity in a region, or at least, it's like any market, they want to be able to project scarcity to maintain pricing. On the other hand, if they're running out of power capacity, they don't necessarily want to let on that's what's taking place either. So yeah, it's a lot of that usual marketplace give and take that's going on, that you've got to do some probing to actually pierce through some of the posturing that may be taking place.
Yeah, additional posturing might include things like, they might be a little over optimistic, especially with today's supply chain shortages that we're facing still, about when that data center is going to be ready to use. So this is where a lot of our on the ground research comes into play. We're paying attention to what's going on because we're seeing it firsthand. So it's really how the DCKB kind of stands outside of what's existing out on the internet. And those are kind of the challenges we're facing there.
I mean, once the shell of the building goes up, it's really hard to see what's actually taking place inside unless you go inside.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the other things that we see in a lot of markets is it may seem like at first glance that there's just a ton of capacity out there. But one of the things that we often find is that several of these little data centers might be inside the same one big data center. So, the market comes across as much bigger, but once you realize that, there's 7 little facilities inside this other big data center owned by a different provider, and then you account for that double space, if you will, the market tends to be a lot smaller than at first glance. And that's where some of our other research aspects come into play. The second thing that I think of is that the DCKB can stand alone, and there are several customers that use it all by itself. But it's actually optimal to pair that with some of our other offerings to get the full story of a market or a region, because every market has some unique characteristic that drives growth, or lack of growth in some cases, and we're keeping a pulse on all of that as well.
It's interesting that there's that risk of double counting because you've got different channels, you got different people who are selling capacity, and it depends upon the nature of the market. I would presume that to figure out, who is it? Are you going direct to the actual owner of the facility itself? Are there subcontractors that are selling small pieces of it? And then, of course, you get hyperscalers who exist in multi-tenant facilities as well.
Exactly. So lots of integral pieces there of that puzzle. So
All sorts of things to be able to deal with. Wow.
yeah.
Well, and I think we touched on some of the uses of the integration of all this data. When we start thinking about what that potential is, it's really limited only by a lot of the creativity that we're willing to apply to it. Because we've got, as you're saying, we've seen use cases around energy management, sustainability, of course, is a big one. As you're pointing out, sustainability is something that is currently, top of page headlines, what we're seeing in terms of levels of concern. But it's also something that we're seeing clients trying to work through issues of, where are the best or most sustainable places to be able to run compute loads? Are they able to move off of their environments? What could they potentially do? We've had a lot of conversations on the podcast about the transition in data centers and historical enterprise data centers that typically haven't been tremendously efficient. Moving into multi-tenant environments, they could potentially be more efficient. What do they need to do that? Where are they located? There are so many different pieces that come into play in making those decisions. More data, hopefully, is better.
Yeah. So by pairing our DCKB with our other offerings, like our reports that offer deeper insight into specific markets or providers, inquiry time with an analyst is really valuable. You get to ask specific questions. We also use the DCKB to develop custom or ad hoc reports for markets or subregions, providers, and even facility level competitive analysis. Our customers are able to actually get a full picture, and see all of the individual aspects that contribute to the data center industry and its growth. And then in one of our newest test products, we're actually expanding outside of our own team. We're working to combine the DCKB data with true cost data. And true cost is another S&P product that offers a broader look at ESG, and it helps companies with their sustainability efforts. So what we're doing there by combining that data is looking to compare key data center locations with the physical asset risk like coastal flooding and other natural disasters, as well as the availability of resources like energy and clean water access.
Uh,
Uh-huh.
yeah,
Yep.
interesting aspects. The true cost data to be able to understand climate related issues, as you're identifying heat risk, flood risk, those sorts of things, to pull those together as well.
Yeah. So what we've seen more recently is that we have in the news seen more complaints about the amount of water that data centers are using for their cooling systems, especially in water scarce areas. Phoenix comes to mind, and the data centers are now competing with citizens for these resources. So this kind of combined data could potentially help data center providers make decisions focused on both the physical risk, but also the social impact of a particular site. And it could also help them look to more sustainable infrastructure that doesn't rely on those scarce resources. It's really
Ah,
interesting, and we're pretty excited about it.
being able to identify up front that water scarcity already exists and to account for it and to site in places that are more responsible.
Absolutely.
Man, more stories about data that comes together.
Yes. And I think the last thing really about the DCKB is it's continuously updated. We're always evolving it. We're constantly looking for ways to improve the customer experience, to add more relevant data, and to combine it with other products across S&P so that our customers can get that holistic view of the industry. So we're always looking for new stuff.
Well, it's that combination that, as we are fond of saying, gives us data that delivers.
Exactly.
Well, but that's the piece. It's being able to bring together these different aspects. And when you are able to build on that intersection, that's really where the power of the data is.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been great, Stephanie. Many thanks. It's been great having you on the podcast.
I am happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
And that is it for this episode of Next in Tech. Thanks to our audience for staying with us. And thanks to our production team, including Carolyn Wright, Ethan Zimmon, and Syed Waji Abbas on the marketing and events teams, and our studio lead, Kyle Cagnalosi. I hope you'll join us for our next episode, where we're going to be talking Super Bowl. We've gone from one mega sporting event to another. I hope you'll join us then, because there is always something next in tech.